So before we begin, let me just say that this is not so much to create conflict about the artistic style between Star Trek and Star Wars, but to start a discussion. In this instance, this isn't a versus video, this is not even a crossover. This is about the difference and the styles between the designs of Star Trek ships versus Star Wars ships, how they're different and what the style means. It could be that in some cases, one design style is a little bit artistically superior to the other. And this all came up because as I began to model in 3D graphics Star Trek ships and Star Wars ships, sometimes alternating between the two, I did find that there is a certain difference. There's definitely a difference in design style. I did feel that when modeling certain ships, that this was a superior design versus the equivalent ship in the other universe, and why that was. First, let me just say that the design styles are vastly different, and they both have their own different rules. So in Star Trek, these are the rules. The Star Trek ships are all about the warp nacelles. The warp nacelles are the means of propulsion, and everything is designed pretty much around them, unless, it's a very alien ship like a Borg or a Tholian or maybe a Ferengi. But even in the case of the Ferengi, the ship has to have some sort of warp drive system. Now, it may be vastly different than Starfleet's warp drive system. It may not be a nacelle. It may be something like a ring, like we see in the Vulcans, right? But there is some sort of warp drive system. Usually it's a nacelle, and sometimes that nacelle can be 1, sometimes it can be 2, usually it's 2, sometimes it can be 3 or 4. But everything kind of comes together around the nacelles. And just because there are certain rules doesn't mean that the design is restricting. What it does is it forces you to devise a way to make the design interesting, right? Another thing about Star Trek is the weapons are usually hidden or obscure. In some cases they're pretty prominent, but usually the weapons are especially things like phasers or disruptors, are mostly hidden. Almost every detail in a Star Trek ship has some sort of specific function or purpose. Almost. So when we are looking at a Star Trek ship, Starfleet ship, for example, it almost always has a bridge. It almost always has a navigational deflector. It almost always has an impulse drive system. And it almost always has warp nacelles. And usually some sort of shield grid, which is greebled into the hull. And then from starting in the late 70s and 80s, almost always has Aztecing, right? Which is the very fine hull plating that you see from different angles when you're looking at the ship, right? Other things in the ship seem to have purpose, such as reaction control thrusters, hatches, shuttle bays, docking ports, sensors. All of these details are sort of a checklist that you go through when you're designing a Star Trek ship. And you say, oh, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. In a lot of ways, it makes it easier to design a Star Trek ship, or to redesign a Star Trek ship, as I often do, because it allows, you don't have to come up with details on the fly. So those are the basic rules of a Star Trek ship. The Star Trek ships always have space cruisers. The space cruisers are the primary ship in Star Trek. A ship where a lot of people work and live. It's a big ship. It's all about the storyline and character development. And for that reason, that's where the design emphasis is. That's where all the artistic emphasis is in Star Trek. In Star Wars, we have different rules. The engines and thrusters are almost always prominently featured, unless it's something like a TIE fighter. The capital ship shapes are usually fairly indistinctive. The Star Destroyer wedge shape is a distinctive shape, but it's simple. It's a simple geometric pyramid that's elongated, and that's pretty much it. Very simple. There's not Nacelle is a primary hull. A saucer, like you see in Star Trek, is just a simple geometric shape for the most part, right? However, the detail on larger Star Wars ships especially are maddeningly prominent. There's so much detail in greebling and lines and plates and armor and stuff on there. And the nice thing about Star Wars is the way they do this detail. It all makes it look as if it might have an engineering function, even though in fact it does not. It's just an arbitrary detail. But there's so much of it in the way you do it. You know, there's a right way to do hull greebling. That's actually a little bit easier to do with a physical model than a CG model, because of the physical model, all you have to do is go and grab random details out of a model kit and glue them onto the structure, and quite often you can make it look pretty cool. However, in CG, you kind of have to decide, where am I going to put this detail? How much am I going to greeble it? You have to go through and do each individual item, and unless you happen to have a bunch of 3D assets somewhere that you can paste onto the ship, sort of kit bash the details onto the ship, which often doesn't quite look right. Now, so far I'm just talking about capital ships in Star Wars, but let's talk about the fighters and the smaller ships. Now, the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek is the setting is almost always on a big space cruiser in Star Trek, but in Star Wars the setting is often on a small ship like the Millennium Falcon, and the action scenes very often take place on a small ship like the Falcon, or a fighter like the X-Wing or the Slave One, etc. Now, you notice that these smaller ships are very distinctive. When you see the Millennium Falcon, you know what that is. You know right away, that's the Millennium Falcon based on the shape, right? So you see that ship, you know that. In the same way that when you see the design of the Enterprise, you know it, right away. It's so distinctive. So the distinctiveness of the design is very comparable to Star Trek when it comes to the smaller ships in Star Wars. Now, they still add a bunch of what is probably arbitrary detail that is artistically placed in a way that it looks like it's got function, even though it may in fact have no function at all. On fighters, the weapons are emphasized quite a bit as well. You can, like on an X-Wing, you typically see the weapons very distinctively. TIE fighters, not so much. TIE fighters are kind of a weird animal altogether. But just to emphasize my point that the smaller ships are what Star Wars is most important. In The Force Awakens, we barely got a glimpse of the Star Destroyer. Star Wars emphasizes the grit, and you can often see, like on X-Wings or the Falcon, etc., burn marks, chips in the paint, scratches. It's pretty dirty and gritty. Even on some Imperial ships, you see, dirty and gritty details. In Star Trek, not so much, perhaps because of the more positive view that Star Trek has relative to other sci-fi universes. Now, Star Wars is more about fast-paced action, and Star Trek is not. So in fast-paced action, you're not necessarily going to see that on a capital ship. Sometimes, but not necessarily. Fast-paced action, you're much more likely to see that on a fighter or a small ship, and that's why the fighters have much more distinctive designs. Now, both are great, and both artists in both franchises put in a lot of work. Industrial Light and Magic was the primary model creator for Star Wars, and then certain artists from Industrial Light and Magic did Star Trek the Motion Picture, and then Industrial Light and Magic themselves did the graphics for Star Trek The Wrath of Khan and Star Trek 3. And in Star Trek 3, we can really start to see some differences, some Star Wars-like ships, like the Burrell Bird of Prey. I'm sure the audience wouldn't have been surprised to see something like a Burrell in Star Wars. So what we have is, by the 80s, by the time Star Trek the Motion Picture comes out, we see a lot more detail in Star Trek ships, and it easily matches the fine detail in Star Wars ships. And combined with the, distinctive designs of Star Trek ships. They just, they make the ships freaking awesome. My personal opinion is that the large ships on Star Trek are aesthetically superior to the large ships on Star Wars in distinctive, etc. And the small ships in Star Wars are generally much more aesthetically interesting than the small ships in Star Trek. Now, of course, there are always exceptions. That is my personal opinion. Feel free to share your personal opinion in the comments. My channel is relatively new. Only started taking YouTube seriously about 6 weeks ago. But if there is any way in hell I can do this most of the time, I sure would like to. That being said, feel free to support the channel on Patreon. Feel free to like and subscribe. Love to hear your comments. Let me know what you think, guys. Keep evolving, my space friends, and be well.